So it's my pleasure. I think the next talk is actually very well timed here based on this interest and discussion. Our next talk is from Dr. Sander van der Linden, who's a postdoc here at Princeton with appointments at the Andlinger Center in the Department of Psychology and in the Woodrow Wilson School. Sander earned his PhD from the London School of Economics and is an expert in decision-making and relevance to energy decisions and climate change. He has involvement with the energy group at Yale. So today, do we have his slides? We do. Behavioral science and the environment, the human dimension. So Sander, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Hope I can entertain you a little with my ideas about behavioral science and why it's important to consider the human dimension when talking about energy and the environment. So I wanted to talk a little about the role of behavioral science, or the behavioral sciences and issues related to energy and the environment. A little about my research program in pro-social behavior, empathy, and intrinsic motivation, and how that's related to encouraging people to conserve energy and to act pro-environmentally. Wanted to talk a little about social norms and sort of the power that institutions have to institute social norms, as well as the role of behavioral science in public and energy policy and what we could contribute to the debate and hopefully some takeaways. So I like to define behavioral science as an interdisciplinary field of study that systematically looks at human behavior and decision-making through both naturalistic observation as well as controlled experimentation. And unfortunately, up until now, behavioral science hasn't really played a large role in the public policy debate, especially not when it comes to issues related to climate, energy, and environmental policies. And I think this is really interesting because studies have shown that, at least on a national level, implementation of changes in individual behaviors and lifestyles could contribute up to as much as a reduction of 20% in emissions from households, which comes to about 7.5% in national US emissions. Some models put that number much higher. And the way that they sort of determine these type of models is that we look at what's the percent of the population that is able or in a position to change their behavior. Then something we call behavioral plasticity, or the ease with which behaviors can be implemented, or the adoption of new behaviors. And then finally, the probability that people will actually implement those actions. So I love this quote. Energy policies and programs need to replace outmoded assumptions about human behavior, and they must integrate insights from the social and behavioral sciences with those from engineering and economics. And that's hopefully the message that I'll try to communicate today. So there's this long-standing sort of idea between the rational economic man, the idea we're all inherently selfish, utility maximizers, and our behavior can only be modulated by increasing taxes or lowering taxes versus, the irrational Homo sapiens that we are. I don't really like this dichotomy too much because to me, rationality or irrationality doesn't really mean anything unless we consider the context or the environment in which a certain decision is made. But there is this pervasive assumption about the nature of human motivation in public policy and in certain disciplines that I think is not entirely correct. And so basically, human motivation is sourced from two different areas. There's the extrinsic source. This includes financial rewards, incentives, and they tend to be short-term, or at least they tend to have an effect on behavior for as long as the incentive can be maintained. And then there's the intrinsic part, sort of the processes and the beliefs and the emotions that people experience, which tend to be long-term drivers of behavior, of values, and our worldviews. And as a psychologist, I'm more interested in that side of things and exploring how intrinsic motivational processes influence behavior. Here at Princeton, we have an initiative called Campus as Lab, and the idea is to sort of explore interesting science questions and use the university as a ground for experimentation. I'm a big fan of this idea. And one of the first things that I noticed when I arrived at Princeton was this energy conservation campaign. And I thought that was really interesting because a competition is an extrinsic incentive in some ways, and competition is a dominant force in society. Basically, we observe it in markets and lots of different areas. And of course, its better half cooperation, people tend to talk less about. But I think that's at least equally important. And so this competition, the idea of the competition is that students, all residential colleges, they compete with each other over the course to try to reduce their energy consumption. And the college that wins, the reward is some type of study break. And this is not just Princeton, that's part of a national campus conservation nationals competition, and hundreds of universities across the country participate in these type of campaigns, and then they try to get students excited about reducing their energy consumption. So Princeton teamed up with a company called Watt Vision, and they provide a live stream to students with the energy consumption in each residential college, and then they try to translate it into the equivalent, the kilowatt hours you could use to charge laptops. And then you get this nice number in terms of how it compares to baseline consumption and how well they're doing. And my question was, well, that's really interesting, but in terms of the aggregate energy consumption on campus, do these campaigns actually collectively impact people's behavior? And if so, how long does the effect really last? And when we looked at the data, we published a study on this in Nature Climate Change on intrinsic motivation and pro-environmental behavior. And the idea of it was really simple. So here's the results of that. And you see here that at the beginning of the competition, or before the competition started, energy consumption was rising, so there was an upward trend. But as soon as the competition started, there was a significant trend change in the model, and energy consumption across campus went down pretty significantly. This is a pretty steep trend. But then as soon as the competition ended, there was another significant trend change, all right? And so basically, people went back to what they were doing before. And the reason why I thought this was interesting is because it illustrates in a nice way the fundamental characteristics of extrinsic incentives. They tend to work for as long as they're maintained, and sometimes they can actually undermine people's motivation in some sense. There's something I call negative goal replacement. So let's say before the competition started, you were excited about reducing energy consumption, or you had motives to do so, but now that goal has been replaced with a self-serving motive, in this case, winning the competition. And so we have these extrinsic incentives, competitions, and rewards, and intrinsic factors. And yeah, sometimes dangling goodies in front of people works, for at least in the short term, right? Sometimes giving people money. Sometimes people respond to that. But we also care about the environment. Lots of people care intrinsically about the environment. And there was an article in the New York Times not too long ago basically arguing that recycling is a waste of time and that we should simply tax people and move people's excess garbage to a landfill, a more efficient landfill, obviously. And I wrote a letter to the New York Times saying, well, everything we know from behavioral research suggests that that's probably a bad idea, in the sense that when you give people the option to buy out of their environmental responsibility, it doesn't really engage people with the issue. So let's say that, sure, you can use the money that we tax people to offset their environmental impact, but that's sort of a short-term way of thinking about it, right? When it comes to some of these issues that are long-term and require long-term cooperation, long-term engagement from people, taxes may not simply do the trick. In fact, they often undermine people's motivation. Basic research in psychology shows that children who expect a reward for an activity are less likely to continue to perform the activity than those who are intrinsically motivated. Why is that? Because people's utility from the reward decreases over time, whereas the utility in the other case is your own motivation, right? It's a self-sustaining system. And so I'm really interested in this particular phenomena, partly because the process that underlies some of our intrinsic motivation is the ability to experience empathy. Empathy is an evolved capacity, and I'll try to show you some pictures and see if I can move you a little. This was a picture that was in the media recently. Now, many of us, we don't see polar bears all the time, but some of my friends are biologists and they were really shocked by the image because they know polar bears are supposed to be fat and happy. And the picture didn't really look like this particular polar bear is. But this picture usually does it. And so the ability to experience empathy is often automatic and intuitive. And really, empathy has two components. There's a cognitive component, or what we call a cognitive perspective-taking component, and that's the ability to sort of think about how someone might feel, sort of put yourself in someone else's shoes, and then there's the emotional component, which is called the emotional contagion component of empathy. So if your empathy system is working, most people, when they look at the cat, they intuitively experience a sad feeling. And this is what's called an emotional contagion because the cat has experienced it. We don't only see that in other humans, we also see that in other animals, and it's hugely evolutionarily adaptive to be able to read emotions in other people and other animals because it's extremely functional in group living. I'll show you a happy picture just because I don't want to leave you with a sad feeling. So here's a picture of the brain. The cognitive perspective taking part that I was talking about, that's really sort of happening here in the medial prefrontal areas of the brain, whereas the emotional contagion aspect is rooted in more subcortical structures. This is the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. And so these are deeper structures that are older evolutionarily, whereas the cognitive perspective taking is a little newer, but they often work together. But I wanted to investigate this cognitive perspective taking idea a little further. I'll talk about that in a second. I love showing this video because it illustrates that humans aren't not inherently selfish. This is from the Evolutionary Institute for Adaptive Behavior in Berlin, and they do experiments with children to see if, without telling them, without instructing them, if they're inclined to help people. And so you see time and again when they do these type of experiments, right? They're not thinking about pros and cons and selfish versus altruistic trade-offs. They simply see what's going on, and they help the person because it's intuitive. In many ways, it's an evolutionarily adaptive behavior because helping people, helping others in the group is a functional behavior. And so they do a lot of these experiments. And he's really struggling, but he's offering help. After a while, they get skeptical and they start wondering about people's motivations. Is he really? Yeah. First time he does it, he helps the individual. Now, see, the second time he gets more skeptical. It's like, hey, wait a second. So they do this with not only with children, but with chimps too. Our closest relative, and they show much of the same behavior. So it's not just humans; it's something that is a mechanism that is common. So how do we get from feeling good about helping other people and making a positive contribution to the environment to actually acting good, right? That's an important question. So I did this longitudinal study where I really wanted to know if our feelings about this actually impact our behavior. So this was a national study, and in the second wave, we followed up with the same individuals 4 weeks later. And the idea was, I was curious in the question of whether or not the anticipated sort of positive affect influences our behavior 4 weeks later as compared to something we call negative affect, for example, guilt. So you might think, helping the environment makes me feel good about my contribution. Does that actually predict energy conservation behavior 4 weeks later? Or maybe people are doing it because they don't want to feel guilty. And sort of what's the relation between feeling good and feeling guilty? So that was the basic idea. And here's sort of a picture of, I investigated 20 different behaviors from maintaining correct tire pressure on your car, so the easy behaviors, turning down your thermostat, reducing the number of miles that someone flies, all the way to purchasing a fuel-efficient car and green energy. And of course, people are more likely to engage in the easier behaviors and not so much in the more costly behaviors. But we sort of created an index where we collapse all these behavior together and call them pro-environmental behavior. And so here you see that, in fact, when you ask people, how would you feel about engaging in those behaviors, people tend to say, well, I think that would make me feel good, and that actually pretty well predicts their behavior 4 weeks later. There's a concept in psychology we call behavioral intention. And our intention to do something is often the most proximal determinant of our behavior. So I was interested in controlling for our intention to perform a behavior. Do those sort of feelings still really affect behavior? So here's another model. And here you see that the way that we feel about engaging in those behaviors, sort of that positive, feel-good, economists call warm glow from acting environmentally friendly not only influences our intention to perform those behaviors and explains it pretty well, it still has a direct impact on behavior 4 weeks later. So that idea that people are intrinsically motivated, that they anticipate to feel good about acting environmentally friendly and conserving energy does actually influence behavior. Now, this is an interesting correlational pattern. There's a concept in psychology where we say that liking something is not the same as disliking something. And it has to do with attitudes and the asymmetry of how people form attitudes towards objects. But here, that tends to be the case where there's a few people who anticipate feeling good from acting pro-environmentally friendly who wouldn't feel bad if they didn't. But for most people, that means the same thing. It's a very high correlation. So, people that anticipate feeling good from helping the environment also anticipate that they would feel bad if they wouldn't help the environment. But the idea here is interesting because even though it's a correlation, the direction of causality is a bit more interpolable in the sense that our base state is to feel good about ourselves. We want to maintain a positive level of self-esteem and feelings about ourselves. So it's not that if you ask people, why did you conserve energy? It's not that people say, well, people might say, oh, I didn't want to feel bad about not caring about the environment. But why do people not want to feel bad? Because they want to feel good. That's their base level, right? So that's the idea. Lots of research shows that extrinsic incentives actually undermine people's personal motivation to help. Right? Basically, when you do something for someone or tell them that they simply have to pay a tax, it tends to crowd out, replace our intrinsic motivation, sort of that negative goal replacement that I talked about. And the best example I have for this is a recent study that came out in PNAS. And this is, they tracked energy consumption for over 100 households in an 8-month period. And in one condition, they gave people a monetary incentive frame. And in the other condition, it was a health frame where they basically told people, reducing energy will help clean up the air in this neighborhood and will be good for you and for your children. And things people are intrinsically motivated to care about. And you see that in the monetary condition, people actually increased their energy consumption over the period. Whereas in the intrinsic condition, people significantly reduce their consumption. And here you can see that sometimes those incentives can actually backfire and undermine people's personal motivation to do something. Not saying that external incentives are always bad, but it's important to think about how they influence behavior and to design incentives in a way that work well with people's intrinsic motivation instead of undermining it. So I wanted to shift gears a little now and talk about the power of social and institutional norms. Usually it's through social comparison that people validate the correctness of their opinions and ideas. Now you might say, oh, not me. I'm not influenced by what other people think, but people also greatly underestimate the extent to which they're influenced by others. I think Linden just mentioned an example of if someone else jumps off a cliff, would you do it? Maybe not in that extreme sense, but we can actually model the way that people rely on social norms and whether or not that actually leads to a positive outcome. Generally, we distinguish between two separate kinds of norms: descriptive norms, which simply describe the behavior of others, as well as prescriptive norms. So prescriptive norms tell us something about how we ought to behave. There's a company called Opower, and they've been sending out personalized energy statements to their customers for a long time now. And they try to utilize insights from behavioral science to influence people's behavior. And what they do is they sort of compare people's energy consumption to that of the average of their neighborhood. When they started doing that initially, they realized that there was a peculiar effect in the sense that when they simply described a norm, sometimes that would backfire in the sense that when they told people they were doing good and conserving energy more so than their neighbors, people thought, oh, well, so then I can increase it a little. If I'm doing so much less than my neighbors, I can probably increase my consumption a little. And so it's important to align descriptive with prescriptive norms. If I tell you that 80% of people here in this room are unsustainable, people might start to think that that's a good thing, right? So it's important to prescribe how we feel about those norms. So here's an example of the energy bill that they used. And here you see the consumption level and how it compares to someone's neighbors. And here's the prescriptive norm, where they simply put a smiley face on there and tell people they're doing good or bad as compared to the norm. You might think, well, this is very simplistic, and it is a scalable strategy, but they've been doing this with lots of customers, and it works. It reduces people's energy consumption by a few percent points on average. You might think, what's a few percent points? But millions of customers, that does add up. And one particularly important concept is the ability for institutions to signal norms. So institutions, just like Princeton, our decisions and innovations have the ability to communicate what type of norms we would like people to follow. And I think this is an incredibly important concept, not only for governments, for corporations, and for universities, but for basically any institution can set an anchor or a default behavior for the group. And the idea is that by setting a sustainable alternative as a default, people tend to think that it's the prototypical choice for the group. And one issue that I've been investigating quite a bit is water conservation. I think water conservation is an incredibly important concept. I just came back from California, climate change and droughts, and it's a real issue. I think 1 out of 10 people now don't have access to clean and safe drinking water, and so the interplay with other environmental issues is it's really important. And so I wonder, what's Princeton doing about this? So Princeton started this initiative where they started giving out these Algene reusable bottles to incoming students. And I thought, well, that's interesting. These bottles, they're not as cheap as putting a smiley face on an energy bill. They're about $10. This is what they're called sustainability survival kits. And every incoming student gets one. And I wondered, well, if we set that as the prototypical choice for the group, if incoming students get this bottle and say, this is the sustainable alternative that we would like you to follow, does that actually impact people's behavior and their perceptions? For example, do they drink less bottled water? Are they more supportive of bottled water bans on campus? These type of questions. So when you look at, so the university, they did a survey among undergraduate students on campus. And when you look at the results, again, this was a nice sort of naturally occurring experiment where we had groups of students who received the bottle and groups of students who didn't receive the bottle. And you see here that the amount of students that say that they never drink bottled water is much higher among the group that received the bottle than among the group that either no longer has the bottle or never received the bottle to begin with. And this is a trend you see all the way across, that even those who drink bottled water over 6 times a week, they're still less likely to drink bottled water than the other groups, and these differences are significant. You might think, well, to some extent, maybe students who received the bottle were already more likely to reduce their consumption, and so it's not a controlled experiment. We can't rule out some of these explanations, but it's certainly interesting. And here you see that students who received a bottle are much more supportive of a bottled water ban on campus, sort of the normative claim that Princeton should not be selling bottled water, than students who didn't receive the bottle. The interesting aspect about this is that there's a time element involved, right? Students received a bottle, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 years later, it's still impacting their behavior and their perceptions. Unfortunately, we weren't able to control for the exact year that students received a bottle, so it could be anywhere between 1 and 4 years. But it's really interesting that all those years down the line, it's changed their behavior and their perceptions of the norm on campus. So institutions have potential to really change the way students and think about pro-environmental behavior. And the same goes for institutions and businesses and governments. And here you see there's a mediation model. The way it works is that you receive a bottle, then you change your behavior, and then you actually change your perception of the norm, which the psychologist is interesting because usually the way we think about things is that first we change a norm and you change your behavior. But sometimes changing someone's behavior first can be a good idea. So can behavioral science inform energy policy? We just released a paper in the context of climate change that is featured on the Woodrow Wilson School, did a great job with that. And we sort of distilled 5 best practice insights from psychology to inform climate policy making about, or to use behavioral science to inform policies about energy and climate change and how to more effectively use policies leveraging behavioral insights. And we created this table. Policymakers don't have a lot of time. This is what the editors told us. So it's like, if people don't read your paper, just create a table with 5 key guidelines that could help policymakers improve their policies. So we included some of the things we talked about, tapping the potential of intrinsic motivation. People respond to group norms. The human brain prefers experience over analysis. And so there's these important concepts that hopefully translate into actionable policy recommendations for how the government can use these insights. So I have 1 minute left, I see. Conclusion, behavioral science, at least I hope to have convinced you a little that behavioral science has an important role to play, not only in directly reducing emissions from households in a direct way, but also indirectly by building bottom-up support for climate, environmental, and energy policies, both by educating people, by thinking about how people think about science, by trying to depoliticize issues, and building support for some of these initiatives. Hopefully, I've tried to convince you that we're not hopelessly irrational and that we're not always motivated by money and external incentives. People want to help, they want to play a role. Building systems and technologies that allow people to still make a contribution is incredibly important. All of the experiments I show you are really low cost and scalable strategies that we can use to change human behavior in the long term. And so behavioral responses to technology and policies, they can be modeled too, and they should be integrated in environmental and economic models. Thank you for your time.
Okay, so questions? There's one, yeah.
I'm trying to parse between your opening example and your closing example, as both dealt with competition. You know, that the competition among the residential colleges you read as extrinsic, and yet the competition between the homeowners you read as intrinsic. And is the key difference this establishment of the norm, that the norm is missing in the residential college competition? Or is it the fact that there was yet another external element that was introduced into it? But, I mean, they both were competition.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the answer to that is that the second example, the norm example, that is actually also an example of what starts out as an extrinsic incentive. So social norms, to some extent, are extrinsic in the way that you have to be maintained in order for them to influence behavior. So what's interesting, though, is that those personalized energy bills, the bills are maintained in the long term. So it's not a short-term incentive. They try to maintain that norm for as long as they can. And there's a really interesting relationship between social or extrinsic norms and internal norms, in the sense that when does a norm become internal? When people internalize a social norm. So a social norm can actually guide people's behavior in the long term once people have been exposed enough to the norm that they internalize it and sort of start to believe in it themselves. So what initially can start out as being an external influencer can actually be leveraged to guide your behavior in the long term when people internalize that norm. The problem with many sustainable behaviors is that the social norm is not very well articulated, and so people don't internalize it.
So, I'll ask you a question
Sure.
based on what you just said. So the study that you showed with the smiley face on your utility bill, that I'm assuming was done in the United States, right?
Yes.
So as you do that, and then as you create this table at the end of your paper, how does this translate to a different culture? So if you did this study in China, or if you did it in India or Africa, and you did, you know, the cultural norm, how does that play into it, and does that change how you make recommendations?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. To some extent, you know, sometimes people ask me about universal laws in psychology, or if we have any. Some of these processes, they vary from culture to culture. But perhaps the most famous example of something that we think is universal are norms, in the sense that people are affected by social norms. But the norms might be different in each culture. And so to some extent, the policy recommendations we made here were specifically targeted towards the US government, because President Obama recently signed an executive order to use behavioral science insight to better serve the American people, including energy studies. But we try to do these studies in other cultures as well to see how norms compare and how they can be implemented in different countries. But to the extent that they're scalable and generalizable, I think that's limited. At least these studies, these effects are relatively similar in Western cultures, where it differs in other cultures, definitely.
At the workshop yesterday in architecture, a professor there was saying that the role of architects today is to change the perception and to convince people that energy efficient buildings are beautiful, even if currently they are not perceived as such. So again, changing the norms. So norms are important, but how do you change them at a large scale? How do you convince people, or how do you nudge it in one direction or another?
Yeah, I think that's, of course, another really good question. How to scale norms. So sometimes I mean, this is a relatively new field of study, but people are trying to see to what extent norms spread in networks and how they collectively affect behavior. So there's some evidence to suggest that norms can quickly spread among a population and influence behavior. But it requires a certain momentum in order for the norm to be adapted. For example, good example was the ALS campaign that was done a few years ago, where all of a sudden people started pouring a bucket of water over their head in order to support the campaign. But that was something that spread really quickly, and that sort of became a norm on various media networks. But in terms of societies and how these norms spreads, I mean, it takes a long time for people to internalize norms. I think there's no way around that. In order to actually shift the norm in an entire country or countries, it requires long-term exposure to differences in values and beliefs and how these things evolve. And it requires an integrated effort from both top-down in terms of government as well as bottom-up processes, because people perceive inconsistencies between norms. We observe that in experiments all the time where we have to artificially create some of these norms in order to get people to act pro-environmentally by describing that pro-environmental behavior is really common. Well, it's really not, right? But then people go in the real world and they observe that in fact is not the norm. So it's very difficult to actually change those norms on a societal level. But I think architects are in a unique position to shape norms in the buildings that they design, not only by making them more energy efficient, but designing buildings in ways that people can interact with it and understand what the norm is in a particular building is. Environmental psychologists often work with architects to sort of understand how people interact with buildings and designs, and I think there's lots of interesting opportunities there to actually change norms within buildings and infrastructures.
Okay, thanks. Unfortunately, we're out of time, of course.